Hermann Hesse has always been a highly discussed figure. In the history of German literature, apart from the brothers Grimm who wrote fairy tales, no one has ever had such a massive readership as Hesse. His works have been translated into more than 60 languages, with a global circulation reaching a staggering 130 million copies. However, when Hesse received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946, the German critics were in an uproar. Besides the positive voices, the criticism and skepticism were especially harsh. People said that while his works might be suitable reading for young people, awarding him the Nobel Prize in Literature was simply outrageous, an unforgivable mistake. One reason for this was that, although Hesse was a German-language writer, his core readership was not in Germany, but rather in Asia and the United States. In the 1960s, there was a surge in popularity for Hesse's books in America, where hippies fervently passed them around. As a symbol of freedom and rebellion, Hesse even became a spiritual leader for an entire generation of young Americans. The reason Hesse's works resonate so strongly with such a diverse audience is that, in almost all his books, he relentlessly explores the pursuit of sincerity, spirituality, and self-knowledge. At times, he even interrogates the question, "Who am I?" with a nearly brutal intensity. This question lies at the deepest level of every person's soul, profoundly perplexing, yet endlessly fascinating. And know yourself, this is precisely the theme of Demian, the work we'll be discussing today. In this book, Hesse tells us a story about growing up. During one's growth, how does a person break through immaturity and weakness, break free from the shackles imposed by family and society, and embark on an independent path of self-discovery? For Hesse, this transition is vital. It touches on the deepest secrets of human nature and determines whether a person can truly grow into their real self. Welcome to Bookworm Reading. In this episode, let's follow Hesse's depiction and step into the world of Demian. My name is Sinclair. I'm 10 years old and I grew up in a gentle, loving environment. My family is well off. My parents and sisters are all well educated. We live in a tidy, orderly house filled with a soft glow, and my childhood is full of light and affection. At this point, I'm a sweet child with a heart brimming with tenderness, and I feel immensely lucky for having such a home. Because already, I can faintly sense that the world outside my home is something quite different. Every day, our maid would sing and pray with us, her clean hands resting on her neatly pressed apron. In those moments, she belonged to the bright, familiar little world of our home. But when she was in the kitchen or the stables, or when my parents weren't around, she'd tell me stories, frightening and incredible tales from the world outside. I saw, too, how she would argue coarsely with the women next door at the butcher's. I understood then that in those moments she belonged to that other world beyond our home. That other world was full of slaughterhouses, prisons, drunkards, and filthy animals. There were people who stole, robbed, and even killed. Bandits hid in the forest, and arsonists evaded the police. In the midst of this torrent of darkness, my home stood like a fortress of light. Whenever I felt scared of the outside world, all I needed was to leap into my mother's arms. But in the year I turned 10, a crack appeared in my pure little world. That day I was walking along the road with 2 children from the neighborhood who were about my age. Suddenly, a boy 3 years older than us walked over. He was tough and unruly, and I immediately recognized him as Cromer, the notorious local bully. I was frightened of him, but he joined our group without giving us a choice. Cromer led the 3 of us to a bridge and made us climb down the riverbank to collect pieces of discarded metal and other junk, which we had to hand over to him. We didn't dare disobey. We simply treated Cromer's words as commands and complied. After we finished, Cromer spat into the river and started chatting with the 3 of us. The other 2 boys, perhaps hoping to win his approval, began bragging about the pranks they had pulled at school, trying to appear brave. I felt nothing but disgust, but I was also afraid Cromer would turn on me if I didn't play along. Out of fear, I impulsively made up a story, claiming that I had once stolen a bag of expensive apples from the nearby mill. I had always loved reading and making up stories, so when I told my tale, it sounded especially convincing. But this offhand lie brought me unexpected trouble. On the way home that day, Cromer followed me. Just as I was about to reach my house, he suddenly grabbed me and threatened to tell the miller about my supposed apple theft. I was terrified. After all, I'd never actually stolen anything, but I had no idea how to deal with someone like Cromer, who knew no boundaries. I pleaded with him, but he just sneered and dismissed my pleas. Seeing that my defenses had completely collapsed, he casually said, "If you don't want me to snitch on you, give me 2 marks. I'm poor, not like you with your rich father." That was when I realized the horror of Cromer's extortion. It marked the beginning of a long period of bullying. Panicked, I had no idea what to do. At my age, I didn't have any pocket money. If I wanted to hand over the amount Cromer demanded, I would have to steal from my own home. That night, though the warmth of my bedroom wrapped around me like a familiar quilt, I felt as though I had fallen into the hollow of an icy cavern. The mistake looming ahead haunted me. Cromer's threats and scorn echoed in my mind like sinister whispers. Sleep slipped through my fingers, and every familiar object in the house, those quiet companions of daily life, seemed to glare at me with silent accusation. It was as if I had dragged a bitter storm into a place of sunlight. Yet I could not bring myself to speak the truth to anyone, not my parents, not my sisters, not even to the walls that knew my secrets. In the weeks that followed, the serenity of my childhood gave way to a life riddled with dread. I was ensnared in a torment I'd never known before, stealing money again and again, feeding Cromer's demands far beyond our initial agreement. Worn thin by the weight of anxiety, my reflection grew pallid, as though shame itself had drained the color from my face. And when my family offered me love, concern, tenderness, it felt like a blade hidden in kindness. Their warmth became a mirror to my guilt, and that hurt more than punishment ever could. Lost in despair, I felt myself drifting closer to a world beyond the threshold of home, a realm dark, dangerous, and indifferent to all I'd once known. Just then, by some stroke of fortune, I encountered my savior, Demian. He was the new kid in school, recently moved to our little town with his mother, and their arrival quickly stirred whispers among the locals. The family was clearly wealthy, but it wasn't their fortune that caught everyone's attention. It was Demian himself. To me, he seemed like a noble prince disguised in simple garb, wandering the countryside in anonymity. He was a few years older than me, but his speech and bearing surpassed even that age. He didn't run about with the other boys or join their games. He spoke little, yet never seemed withdrawn. His silence felt deliberate, a calm, intelligent composure. In class, he kept to his own work with the quiet intensity of a scholar, and even the teachers treated him with a subtle deference, as though he weren't one of the children at all. At times, his comments and lessons would catch the teachers off guard, exposing insights they could barely respond to. From the moment I laid eyes on him, I was captivated by this boy who stood so distinctly apart. But I had no energy to dwell on Demian, not then. Cromer's bullying had sapped all strength from me. That very day, I'd endured another encounter with him, his extortion growing ever more ruthless. As I trudged home, despair tightening around me like a noose, I heard a voice, clear, deep, and steady, call my name. I turned. There stood Demian. I hadn't said a word, yet in a single glance, he understood everything. He said to me, "You're afraid of certain people and certain things, but there's absolutely no need to be. People should never fear other people. If you're afraid of someone, you're placing their power above your own." I stared at Demian in astonishment, as if I were looking at a magician. Clearly, Demian had just witnessed my encounter with Cromer. He asked me Cromer's name, smiled faintly, and then walked away. Strangely enough, from that moment on, Cromer never appeared before me again. Only once did I bump into him on the street. He gave me an awkward grimace, then turned and ran. I could hardly believe it. Not long ago he had been a powerful enemy, trampling me underfoot. But now, the moment he saw me, he fled like a frightened rat. When I saw Demian again, I couldn't wait to ask him how he did it. Did he beat Cromer up or pay him off? Demian shook his head. "Neither. I don't like fighting. And as for money, didn't you already try that? I just talked to him." With that, Demian calmly walked away. When Cromer smashed a hole into what was once the smooth surface of my world, Demian appeared like a brilliant beam of light from outside, illuminating a new possibility for life. Soon after, Demian and I had our first intellectual clash, and it shook me to the core. One day as we walked home together, we talked about a story our teacher had mentioned in class. It came from the Old Testament. According to the tale, the ancestors of humankind, Adam and Eve, had two sons, Cain the elder and Abel the younger. One day both brothers offered sacrifices to God. God accepted Abel's offering but rejected Cain's. In a fit of shame and rage, Cain killed Abel. As punishment, God banished Cain, but he also marked Cain's forehead to protect him from being slain by others in the wilderness. According to traditional interpretations, Cain is obviously an evil, godless murderer, and the mark on his forehead symbolizes God's mercy toward sinners. That was the perspective I'd learned in class. But Demian saw things differently. He pointed out the strangest detail in the story. Why would a sinner be given a mark that both protected and intimidated others? Demian offered his own speculation. He said that perhaps Cain wasn't truly a murderer. Among humanity, there exists a type of person, people who bear a mark upon their foreheads. Or to be more direct, people who are simply different. They might possess a piercing gaze with extraordinary force, or they might consistently express insights that diverge from the crowd. Such people are often disliked by those around them because their existence highlights others' mediocrity. As a result, they're exiled. Rumors arise. Stories are fabricated, like the accusation of murder. What's fascinating is that the average, mediocre majority rarely dares confront such individuals directly, nor do they admit their own fear. So instead, they interpret the mark as divine protection. This way they can justify their cowardice. Having grown up on Orthodox teachings, I found Demian's ideas utterly shocking. I was afraid of his thoughts. I even considered cutting ties with him altogether. But after that conversation, I began to view everything our teachers taught through a radically new lens. I kept thinking about what Demian had said. Suddenly, I realized, could the Cain he spoke of be none other than himself? Rumors about Demian circulated widely at school. People said his family's wealth was unfathomable, that he and his mother were heretics, that he possessed extraordinary skills, and that he'd dated many girls. His eyes gleamed with courage and wisdom, an unmistakable light that couldn't be hidden. Because of this, people feared him, and that fear turned into myth or malice. But Demian never cared. Every action of his pointed toward a clear and inner purpose. He never needed to explain himself. He always knew exactly what he was doing. Soon, Demian and I became friends in the truest sense, bound by a mutual understanding. Under his influence, my mind developed rapidly. I began to question my parents, my teachers, and the dogmas found in books. I frequently shared my thoughts with him. Sometimes Demian praised my ideas. Other times he cautioned me against falling into empty talk aimed only at gaining approval. Once, in the middle of an animated conversation, Demian suddenly paused, as if annoyed that he'd said too much. He told me, saying clever things out of vanity is meaningless. It only distances you from yourself, and that distancing from the self is a kind of sin. One must learn to withdraw completely into their own world, like a turtle. Later that day during a class, I suddenly felt as if the seat next to me, where Demian usually sat, was empty. I turned to look and saw him still sitting perfectly still, posture poised, but his eyes vacant, as if he were a cold marble statue. It wasn't until the class ended that color returned to his face. He spoke and acted normally, only it felt like he had just returned from someplace far away. There was weariness in his expression. Years later, I finally understood that was Demian's so-called withdrawing into one's world like a turtle. He had dived so deeply into the recesses of his own spirit that even his presence in the real world had grown faint. The days I spent side by side with Demian didn't last long. I moved on to another high school, and for several years afterward, I didn't see him again. By then, I no longer looked like a child. I had grown tall and lean, and to my new classmates, I was an elusive, enigmatic figure. Without Demian's companionship, I began to explore my inner world on my own. I devoured the works of many philosophers, becoming especially captivated by Nietzsche. I also started recording my dreams using the methods of psychoanalysis, which was just beginning to gain traction at the time, and I analyzed the symbols that appeared in them. During this period I also lost my way for a time. I often wandered into taverns, drank myself into a stupor, and in my drunken fervor, preached my ideas to win the admiration of ignorant onlookers. But when the alcohol wore off, I was overcome by profound loneliness. Fortunately, in those days of confusion, I found a spiritual anchor. I fell in love with a girl. This first love of mine was purely spiritual. I never even considered confessing my feelings to her. I simply pushed myself to become better, inspired by the existence of such a lovely being in the world. I returned to a life of reason and decorum. Though this innocent infatuation led nowhere, it became my salvation, helping me escape that absurd chapter of my life. Because I had fallen for that girl, I began to practice drawing. At first, I only wanted to capture her likeness. But over time, painting became a way for me to converse with my own soul. Once, guided purely by imagination, I painted a raptor. Half of its body was trapped inside a dark sphere, and it was straining to break free to soar into the deep blue sky. I stared at the painting for a long time, then suddenly decided to send it to Demian, whom I hadn't contacted in years. I didn't expect much, but to my surprise I soon received a reply. The letter was brief, containing only a single sentence. Yet it was a sentence I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Demian wrote, "The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. To be born, one must destroy a world." Yes, spiritual maturity is always a process of breaking free from constraints. When a person's soul is still in its infancy, it curls up inside the warm shell of the egg, well protected and oblivious to the outside world. But once a crack appears, they glimpse a space far vaster than the one inside the egg. That world holds evil and danger, but for those whose spirits are strong enough, it also offers freedom. In the moment of breaking the shell, the choices one makes determine whether they can truly become a person, whether they can live a life rich and expansive enough to be called their own. Since then, I've gone through many adventures, encountered ancient and mysterious ideas, and met fellow travelers who offered profound inspiration. And when I saw Demian again, we had both shed our youthful innocence. We had grown into two strong, clear-minded young men. It was then that Demian and I truly stepped into reality, into the world beyond the home, into the real world itself. War broke out. Humanity had developed immense industrial power, and this war revealed a level of destruction unprecedented in human history. Cold, mechanical forces were mercilessly devouring what remained of human nature. None of us escaped the flames of war. Demian, a second lieutenant, enlisted. 6 months later, I too joined the army. One night, while on guard duty, I suddenly saw a star streaking toward me from the sky. It was a shell. With a thunderous explosion, the star shattered into 1,000 flames, and my body was hurled into the air, then slammed back down to the ground. When I came to, I was lying in a room for the wounded. It was there that I saw Demian for the last time. He lay on the floor beside me, seemingly more gravely injured than I was. In a soft voice he said to me, "Listen, I have to go. Maybe one day you'll need me again to face Cromer or something else. I won't be able to come to you anymore. But if you listen to the voice deep within your heart, you'll find me there." The next morning, I awoke again and looked toward the floor beside me. Lying there was a stranger I had never seen before. But I was no longer confused that I believed, no, I knew that one day I would find the key meant for me, slip through the door into the depths of my own soul and see my true self. And surely it would bear Demian's face. The story of Demian ends here. Its conclusion is deliberately open-ended. You could interpret it in the most straightforward way, that Demian was mortally wounded in the war. Or you might take a more optimistic view, that he was simply transferred elsewhere. But perhaps there's a third possibility. Throughout the novel, Demian may never have existed as a separate person at all. He could be the voice from deep within Sinclair's soul, the other half of his growing self, emerging along the path of his spiritual development. Demian always appears when Sinclair is most in need, offering strength and guidance in moments of confusion and despair. And once Sinclair's inner world becomes strong enough to pursue his own path, Demian quietly vanishes. In truth, we might say that the more mature Sinclair is the fusion of his fragile self and the ideal persona that Demian represents. This kind of dual self-narrative is not uncommon in Hesse's work. To Hesse, every human personality is a complex unity, and the spirit matures through the process of listening to the countless voices within. Hesse himself was a deeply conflicted figure. He was rooted in the traditions of German literature yet fled his homeland because of war. He longed for warmth and connection, but feared the encroachment on personal freedom. He dreamed of a secluded utopia untouched by the world, yet could never stop caring about that world. In his later years, Hesse became increasingly inward-looking. He tended to his garden in his Swiss home, rarely stepping beyond its bounds. When he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, some in the German literary establishment mocked him as a garden gnome, repeating adolescent spiritual dilemmas in his work. But his supporters believed that Hesse's exploration of the inner self was a way of probing the deepest layers of human nature. Hesse seldom responded to these debates. He simply watered his plants, fertilized the soil, pulled weeds, and took walks in his garden. And it was to a black locust tree in that garden that he dedicated the final poem of his life. At the beginning of Demian, Hermann Hesse, through the voice of Sinclair, wrote a declaration-like monologue that reveals the central theme of the entire novel. My story isn't pleasant, it's not sweet and harmonious like the invented stories. It tastes of folly and bewilderment, of madness and dream, like the life of all people who no longer want to lie to themselves. Every person's life is a journey toward himself, the attempt at a journey, the intimation of a path. No person has ever been completely himself, but each one strives to become so, some gropingly, others more lucidly, according to his abilities. Through the story of Demian, Hermann Hesse conveys this message: that a person starting from a state of primal ignorance must learn to listen to the self, break through the self, and refine the mind in order to ultimately grow into their true and authentic being.
Thanks for watching Bookworm Reading. If you find this episode insightful, please don't forget to share and subscribe to the Bookworm Reading channel. See you next time.